With yesterday's news that Russian programmers were removed from the Linux kernel maintainers list, effectively banned from contributing to the Linux kernel, a number of questions and arguments quickly spread across the developer portions of the internet. And one question was repeated, is from what I could see, more often than any others. And it was a good question to have. Why were Russian programmers banned from Linux, but not Huawei employees? Now, this is an important thing to talk about because there are sanctions against Russia and there are sanctions against Huawei, the company in China, right? There are sanctions in place against both. So why were Russian programmers banned from contributing to Linux, but not Huawei employees? This is a very important question to answer, and there actually is a fairly legal reason for it. Now, many people attributed discrimination. Many people attributed, political bias to the decision-making process here. And as much as I tend to disagree with many of the individuals that run Linux and the Linux Foundation politically, what they're doing here is in compliance with United States law, which is the jurisdiction where they reside. The Linux kernel is predominantly copyrighted within the United States, and both Linus Torvalds and the Linux Foundation are in the USA, right? Now, Linus himself may have been born in Finland, but he is not in there. He's not there anymore. He's in the United States. He lives outside of Portland, Oregon. The Linux Foundation is based on the West Coast as well. So let's walk through the details of exactly what we're talking about here. So Greg Crowe-Hartman submitted the change a couple of days back that removed all the Russians from, at least all the Russians they know of, from contributing to the Linux kernel in that way. And this was based under Executive Order 14071. We covered this in the show yesterday, but the basic idea here is 14071 is an executive order signed by President Biden about 2 years ago, but just now this last month went into effect. It has a 90-day grace period from the date it went into effect until real punishments would come into play if you were not in compliance with the sanctions. It came into effect on September 12th. A little over a month ago. The 90-day grace window is up at the beginning of December. So they've got, a month and a half and some change before they could start really getting into trouble for not being in compliance with these sanctions. Now, 14071 specifically forbids, and I'm just going to read a little bit to you now, export, re-exportation, sale, supply, directly or indirectly, blah, 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 blah. And it provides of anything to Russia, and it has a specific IT section of 14071. And that IT section calls out software development, software engineering purposes, etc. And it's very, very clear that this would apply to, based on United States law, software that is licensed under the GPL, because under a 2017 ruling by a federal judge, a GPL licensed software, if you contribute to it, you are accepting of the license legally within the United States, and that license then becomes a legally enforceable contract. That's just the way federal law works right now. That is the current precedent. So any and all GPL software wherein a portion of the copyright resides within the United States, which is effectively all GPL software at this point. If you've got a developer within the United States that has contributed to a GPL piece of software, and they have not relinquished their copyright to an owner in a different country, then these sanctions would apply to that GPL piece of software, at least as far as the individuals within the United States are concerned. So that is clear, right? So individuals within Russia cannot be allowed by a United States project to contribute, right? And the onus falls on the project within the United States. So in this case, the Linux Foundation, Greg Kroah-Hartman in the United States, I think he's up in Seattle or something like that. Linus Torvalds in Oregon. I mean, the onus is on them, right? And the Linux Foundation. Obviously, the Linux Foundation brings in $250 million every year from member companies who contribute to the project so that they have controlling stake in it. They don't want that cash cow going away because they violated U.S. sanctions, right? And in fact, this actually makes a great deal of sense when you look at the statement that Greg Kroah-Hartman made. The statement he made was weird and vague and bizarre until you start to take it into account that this is because of sanctions. Quote, remove some entries due to various compliance requirements, end quote. Now, that is, compliance requirements is a commonly used phrase for anything that ends up being prohibited because of sanctions. For example, if you have an account with a bank that works in multiple countries, and for whatever reason you cannot have an account there, they oftentimes will have a legal rule that their lawyers have put in place that say, don't tell people it's because of this sanction or that sanction. Say it's because of compliance requirements. So the phrase compliance requirements comes out of lawyers talking about sanctions, right? So that's what that is. Now, the difference here between the Russian sanctions and the Huawei sanctions are fairly significant. It does get into a little bit of a gray area, but they're significant enough that they're worth noting here. So Huawei, yes, does have sanctions against it, and Huawei is based out of China, and Huawei is on an entity list. So basically what Huawei's sanctions mean is that United States companies and organizations are not allowed to give Huawei certain types of technology. So say Intel Corporation can't make a deal with Huawei where Intel provides specific types of technology to Huawei, right? That is limited, and that is overruled by sanctions. However, there are no sanctions against Huawei providing technologies to U.S. companies, right? So if Huawei wanted to make a deal with a U.S. company, they can under the current U.S. sanctions. It's very restrictive, and so restrictive that it in all practical purposes will annihilate many deals that U.S. companies would have with Huawei. And so you've seen certain things happen where U.S. companies won't work with Huawei and Huawei won't work with U.S. companies because of those sanctions. However, employees at Huawei, even working on behalf of Huawei, can provide technology outward to companies or organizations in the United States, which means that Huawei employees can contribute to GPL projects in the United States, right? That is allowed, right? That is allowed. Now, what's interesting here, though, is if Huawei hosts a GPL project, right, one of their projects, it would most likely not be allowed for United States-based programmers to contribute to their project. You see how this kind of works with the specific sanctions imposed by Huawei. So that's why the difference is here. Now that means that there are many Huawei programmers that use a Huawei email account to be approved maintainers of significant portions of the Linux kernel. And some one person, Quake Wang, posted a change request for the maintainers file to the Linux kernel and posted this. And I'm just going to read what he posted here because I think it's kind of funny. Quote, remove some entries due to various compliance requirements. They cannot come back in the future as Huawei is sanctioned by most freedom countries in the world, end quote. He then goes on to remove a number of programmers with at Huawei.com email addresses from the maintainers file. Now, what's amazing here is if you scroll through that list, like I'm doing in the video version of the show right now, you will note that it is an absolutely massive list of engineers that work at Huawei and contribute for their job at Huawei directly to significant portions of the Linux kernel. We've got here working on, let's see, ACPI, the ARM Linux kernel, Block, what else we got here? There's just an absolute ton of them. Various drivers for Express links, DMA drivers, GPIO drivers, RSA engine drivers. I mean, it's a ton of stuff. And so just like with kicking out Russian programmers, kicking out Huawei programmers would have a significant impact negatively on the development of the Linux kernel. However, as far as I can tell, this change that has been suggested has not actually happened. I do not believe that that's going to go through. And the reason for that is an entirely legal one. It's not one that really the people administering or advising the Linux kernel maintainers really have control over. This is simply the state of the law as it stands right now. Yes, Huawei employees can legally contribute to United States-based open source projects under the current sanctions. However, Russian programmers cannot contribute to USA-based open source projects under the current sanctions. That's just simply the fact of the matter. I understand where the confusion comes in, though, because when I first read this, I have a bit of a knee-jerk reaction myself. And so I understand why many people are upset about this. I totally get it. I also completely understand people saying, well, why is this country banned from contributing to the kernel, but not this country? It is entirely a legal thing. The Linux kernel developers, however, have done a real bad job of messaging this, right? They have done dare I say, a piss poor job of this. The Linux Foundation, Greg Crow-Hartman, Linus Torvalds, all of them, they've really screwed the pooch. Because instead of telling people this is a legal requirement because of the jurisdiction where we live, this is what's required, this is what's not required, this is who's allowed and who's not allowed, and we're not banning people because of the country they live in by our choice. We're doing it based on the law of the land. I mean, you'll note that the Linux kernel, and I have a lot of complaints about the Linux Foundation. You've heard me complain about the Linux Foundation, so you know that if the Linux Foundation screws up, I'm gonna nail them. I'm gonna hold them to the wall, and I'm not gonna let up. And you guys know that. But in this particular instance, they actually waited as long as they could to implement these sanctions. Right? These sanctions, remember, were first signed as an executive order by President Biden over 2 years ago, but they weren't forced to go into effect until now. So the Linux Foundation waited as long as they could to actually enforce them. So if it's almost hard to get mad at the Linux Foundation for doing that, if you're like, well, I don't feel like, we should be banning people based on where they live. Well, okay, but the Linux Foundation waited as long as they could to do it. However, Linus Torvalds went out there after all this ambiguity was surfacing, because nobody in the Linux kernel of maintainers in the Linux Foundation was actually telling people what was going on here. You'll note that the only place in the entire internet, the only outlet that's actually talked about the real nitty-gritty detailed of the legal reasons why this is happening is the Lunduke Journal. All the other places have just been mentioning that it's happening and quoting all the crazy quotes. But this is I'm telling you exactly why it's happening here. But instead of explain it to people, which is easy to do. You can literally just link to the sanctions and link to the legal filings and say, this is what we have to comply with. If you have a problem with it, take it up with President Biden, because President Biden's the only one, he signed the executive order. He's the only one that can rescind the executive order, unless Congress votes to rescind it themselves. But that's kind of a massive ask at this point. But instead of explain it to people, Linus came out and went on the attack in a weird political way. I'm going to read it to you now. Quote, this is Linus Torvalds, the founder of Linux, posted to the Linux kernel mailing list in response to all this stuff. Quote, okay, lots of Russian trolls out and about. It's entirely clear why the change was done. It's not getting reverted, and using multiple random anonymous accounts to try to grassroot it by Russian troll factories isn't going to change anything. And FYI, for the actual innocent bystanders who aren't troll farm accounts, the various compliance requirements are not just a US thing. If you haven't heard of Russian sanctions yet, you should try to read the news someday. And by news, I don't mean Russian state-sponsored spam. As to sending me a revert patch, please use whatever mush you call brains. I'm Finnish. Did you think I'd be supporting Russian aggression? Apparently, it's not just lack of real news, it's lack of history knowledge too. Linus. Wow. So, okay. I am amazed by that. Not because it's out of character for Linus. Linus mouths off. Linus has very extreme political views, which are wildly different in most things from me, and that's fine. And he mouths off and says what he thinks, and that's great. What amazes me here is when the only real clear statement of any kind from the Linux Foundation, from Greg Kroll-Hartman, from Linus Torvalds, etc., is this one statement. And it's incredibly aggressive. When he talks about Russian trolls and whatnot, if you look through the Linux kernel mailing list, there's a handful of kind of aggressive statements, not as aggressive as what Linus posted here, but statements where they felt like Russians were being unfairly discriminated against, etc. Those didn't seem troll-like. In fact, most of them that I could see were individuals who have commented to the Linux kernel mailing list in the past, over the past years. And so they seemed like long-time, at least casual developers. And so it didn't really seem like trolls. So Linus coming out and saying that seems a bit reactionary and inaccurate. There might have been a few, anonymous accounts that posted things, but I didn't see much in that regard. It mostly seemed like developers raising legitimate concerns. And instead of saying, well, this is occurring because of these specific sanctions from this executive order and this legal precedent, and so we have no choice in the matter, Linus comes out and attacks people, tells them basically to read the news someday. Geez, what are you, retarded? And he didn't use the word retarded, but I felt like it was almost implied. And just kind of go on the attack against anyone who would be confused by this. Even if you're confused by this, Linus attacks you and calls you a troll and says that you should use your brains and kind of goes on the assault there. That's not that unusual for Linus. I mean, Linus calls people stupid all the time, right? I mean, this has been going back years and years and years. This isn't anything new on that regard. But considering this is such an important issue, this has a dramatic impact on the developers who can contribute to the kernel. Again, to make this clear, we're not talking about one or two, Saturday morning developers who contributed one change request that was like a spelling fix. We're talking about core maintainers of a large number of critical Linux systems that no longer have maintainers. They literally their maintainers were removed, and in some cases entirely, and entire portions, driver stacks and platform support and whatnot were removed that no longer have maintainers in the Linux kernel. Right, it's a big issue. Right? That's a problem for the future development and stability of the kernel. So clearly it should be addressed, and the fact that Linus opts to not address it and instead attack anyone who, most of these people were just asking what the heck's going on, and they didn't know. I mean they didn't know. The last time the Russian sanctions were brought up were over 2 years ago when Biden signed the darn thing, and then nothing happened. So I think it's a fair assumption that a lot of people just assumed, well, this isn't going to impact the Linux kernel, and to have them happen out of the blue, seemingly, well, of course people are going to get kind of freaked out and confused. They needed clarification. This is it's disappointing, but it's par for the course for the Linux Foundation, for Linus, for Greg, for all of them. The whole Linux Foundation, they are terrible at communicating what they're doing to the outside world. I mean, and that's by design. That's by design. Many years back, the Linux Foundation used to have multiple seats on their board that were voted for by the community. So people who are average people like me and you, who might donate to the Linux Foundation, would get and have a membership in the Linux Foundation. We would get a vote. We would get a vote to say who we want to be our community representative on the board. Now, the Linux Foundation board was composed of people from Microsoft and VMware and Oracle and all sorts of different companies, as well as employees of the Linux Foundation. But there would be a few community representatives as well. Not enough to really sway any sort of vote, right? The corporations always had control, but it gave a certain level of transparency, because those community board members could then report back to the community of, what are we voting on within the Linux Foundation? What are the goals of the Linux Foundation? What are the finances? What's happening? What's being discussed? And what are the decisions being made? Those two seats were eliminated, right? The Linux Foundation made a conscious decision to make sure that there was no community representation ever allowed within the Linux Foundation. They kicked them out. They kicked them out entirely. And so they strictly have corporate representation only from companies like Microsoft and the like. And so there really is no transparency in how this decision making goes, which means the onus for talking about all of this stuff falls to the Linux Foundation, to Greg Crow-Hartman, to Linus Torvalds, to Jim Zemlin, the head of the Linux Foundation, and none of them do that. When these things are happening, and I think it's reasonable to come out and state that here are the exact executive orders. This is what we're following. This is how we're complying in good faith, and we don't really have a choice in the matter. That's a reasonable statement to make. It's reasonable. That's within the law. They're allowed to make those statements. They are. And it's not hard at all to make, right? And I don't think most people are going to fault them for saying, here's the law of the country in which we reside. We must comply with this law or we're doomed. So we're going to comply, right? Right? I mean, it is what it is. Now, and we can have an argument after that and say whether or not they should engage in civil disobedience by allowing Russian programmers or not. I mean, we can have that discussion. But currently, what's happening out there on the Linux kernel mailing list, on multiple news sites, the few news sites that are covering this, if you look in their comments section, it's just people arguing about, why is this country included? Well, this is just Linus having political feelings. Well, Linus has clear political feelings. I mean, look at this statement. Crazy, a passionate political feelings. And maybe he would have made this call anyway. Maybe he's happy to make this call. Whatever. Clearly, that seems to be the case. But you'll note that there's none of these outlets are actually reporting the reality of the situation. And that's not that I was going to say that's not the fault of the journalists, but it is. It is both the fault of the journalists for not doing the investigation. The Register, Phoronix, all the other news sites are simply not doing their jobs. They're not looking into this. They're not seeing what the laws are and actually contacting individuals within these organizations to really figure out what's going on. Shame on them. Second, this is also the fault of the Linux Foundation for not simply messaging this massive, massive thing that's happening. It's very important to the Linux kernel, and they're not telling people why it's happening. that is going to lead to a vacuum of information where people are just going to yell about stuff. And the crazy thing is they're going to yell about the wrong stuff because they won't have the correct information. And most journalists out there don't actually go digging for the information. So they're just going to parrot the random yelly things that Linus posts to the Linux kernel mailing list as if that's the news. Well, this is just Linus mouthing off. The reality is very little of this actually has an impact on what is happening. Very little of what Linus is saying here about trolls and whatnot. Yes, it makes for good quotes. It's very sensationalist, blah, 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 blah. It's great. Brings in the eyeballs. But that's not the real core of what's happening. That's not the reason why those people were banned. That's not the reason that Huawei developers are not banned, but Russian programmers are. But now, because you listen to the Lunduke Journal, you know. So please spread the good word. If you can link to the Lunduke Journal, or you can just explain it to people, because my God, it's just not that difficult. And with that, thank you, by the way, to all the Lunduke Journal subscribers, lunduke.com, lunduke.locals.com. You make this possible. Thank heavens you do, because otherwise we would have no idea what's going on in the world. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, nerds and nerdettes across the inner tubes, I do declare, end broadcast.